Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today, we're going to look at two specific things to begin with, and then obviously wrap up with our Primary Vision Frac Spread Count. But the first two is going to look at oil supply demand now that we have some IEA data, OPEC data, and then tie that into, well, where is the economic data to support it? What's going to happen going forward as we look at different refiners after we've talked about it on Wednesday. So let's jump right into this IEA. So the IEA came out with their estimated OPEC decline. So we know that they're taking some off the water. We know that they're taking production down, but it's important to focus on what is on the water currently and then what is slated to come on through loadings. So when we look at the estimated decline from outside OPEC, you can see that we've had the response. We've talked about how right now U.S. production is about 10.8 on its way to 10. And we'll talk about how that's going to happen going forward with the Frac Spread Count. And you can see Canada is down by about 1 million. Right here, we're assuming that you're going to get Canada at about 3.8. But the bigger input is going to be, how do we clear the glut that's currently on the water, in storage, and then at the same time at the refiner? So when we take the next step, you have to look at IEA oil demand. Now, the one thing that's interesting here is you can see obviously the big drop in gasoline demand, but also this resurgence as we go through July, and essentially we close out the summer at the same gasoline demand. Now, if you just consider the change in work from home policies, the change in overall driving, I'm not saying it's going to stay at the low, but it's not going to go back to normal. There's going to be some delta in between that has to be considered, especially when you start looking at gas, oil, diesel in terms of the demand problems that are going to permeate through the system as the economy slowly kind of comes back to normal. So there's going to be these delays, which is why we are relatively bearish on where product demand is going to go over the next, call it 3 to 6 months. So then when we take a step further and look at, okay, well, what is OPEC saying? How are they looking at this going forward? And you can see that they have oil demand in 4Q only about 3 million barrels below 2019. Now, that's really difficult to rationalize if you consider where airlines are and just how much jet fuel it pulls into this system. So jet fuel on average is about 8 million barrels a day of demand. So how much of that is going to come back? And then if you consider, okay, well, how much is diesel going to come back? How much is gasoline going to come back? That 4Q number is a very kind number if you consider kind of where we sit in the world. The NGLs are going to remain relatively stable, like LPG is finding a home. We actually just had India cancel, I think it was 5 or 6 shipments at this point, with some more to be canceled. But again, that's going to be temporary. LPG is going to find a home. The bigger issue is Brazil, Ecuador, Latin America in general, in terms of their loss in gasoline demand and distillate demand. But the emerging markets continue to struggle. And now, as we'll show later on, Europe is going to continue to see some of these headwinds that we're going to talk about across the refining sector. So when we first started looking at this, we kind of created our own numbers based on what happened in China, what could happen overall. So in March, we did just a quick calculation of what was the average demand by country and took the biggest ones. So average demand in this perspective is looking at oil, because if you flip it by who imports the most energy, it's China. But just to keep it simple, this is looking at just oil. So here you can see that a 30% loss, all of a sudden you get a quick 18.4 million barrels a day of just demand gone. And we know that we've gone below 30%. We've reached anywhere from 60 to 70% in different pockets over an extended period of time, which has created these demand issues. So this is not something that comes back overnight, and it's the year-over-year comparisons are going to get harder, especially as we go into driving season. So when we look at this, you have to think of, okay, well, if demand isn't really there and you have product in storage, well, when is that crude going to come off the water? So we use some of the data coming from Vortexa, which is just looking at global crude oil on the water. Now you can see how insane it is in comparison to previous years, and it's starting to stabilize. I mean, as it should. There's only so many tankers available, how much people are willing to cost, how much port congestion can really be maintained. Then you have slow steaming. So there's a lot of reasons why this number is starting to stabilize, but it's still there, and it still has to come off in order to really rationalize, some of these numbers that we're seeing, especially in the market. So when you think about, okay, well, how does this number break down? And you have to consider crude oil on the water in terms of in transit and then in floating storage. In transit is going to start coming down because you're going to have boats showing up at the port. We do have reduced loadings across the OPEC nations. So there's going to be that disconnect, and you're going to get transit coming down. The floating storage is going to be sticky, and it's because, again, the congestion, but also what are refiners doing? Are refiners getting more active? And just looking at both crack spreads, which, don't get me wrong, gasoline crack spreads have flipped from negative to positive, but distillate has actually gotten worse. Gas oil remains under significant pressure. So even though gasoline has bounced a bit, you still have distillate diesel demand, which is struggling, but also is not really yielding any kind of price. So some of this is going to be sticky. Now, when you want to consider, okay, well, who is pumping out what? We'll look at crude loadings based on just looking at Angola, Nigeria, and Russia. Now, Russia has actually guided an additional about 400,000 barrels in loadings for May. So they're actually right back to where they were in 2018 and closer to where they were I think the final number for total was May of last year. And then in terms of 2018, you're right back to that about November number. So you can kind of see that even though they've stepped back, well, how did they do that? They've cut production, but at the same time, they've also cut runs to the lowest it's ever been since 2015. But they've also increased diesel. Now, how do you increase diesel, but you reduce refinery throughput? Well, you take your kerosene or jet fuel and put it into the diesel cut. So you're also seeing that happen in other Middle East countries where, okay, well, oil is down, but refined products is up, and you're seeing more of that flow come into Europe in terms of the Middle East to Europe tanker rates. Angola is relatively stable. Nigeria is the problem, where Nigeria still struggles to sell, and China is essentially sitting there saying, well, what are we going to do? How is this going to work? And China is pulling more from Angola, less from Saudi Arabia. So when we look at the U.S., just a review of just crack spreads, you can see where they sit. You've had some recovery in gasoline, which has kind of helped this bottom out, but it's also being offset based on what we talked about with the distillate cut and the diesel cut, because that 3-2-1 again, three barrels of oil, 2 barrels of gasoline, 1 barrel of diesel. So just to look again, just to reiterate where we sit on the refinery throughput, PADD 3 remains the struggle. 1996 levels, and the overall U.S. production is at about 67%. We think that goes to about 70%. But again, how are you going to pull that off the water? And the economic data still is showing the weight that's going to essentially sit on the crack spreads, but also the demand that's going to pull everything through. When we talk about the refinery demand, you have to consider, well, who are they selling it to? And that's why when we look at the throughput, we've heard Valero, we've heard PBF, we've heard others say that they're going to maintain the 70% throughput for, let's just call it the foreseeable future until they have more indications of recovery. But how are we going to see that recovery? And that's where we start looking at things like the CAS index. So the CAS index comes out once a month. It's a look back in terms of what happened the previous month, but it's a good indication of where do we sit, and then we can start to piece things together, figure out where are we going to go. So truckloads here, you can see they're back down to the 2009 levels. We believe that we're going to stabilize here. We don't really think we're going to come down much further, only because, hey, we've gotten this far. Think about, we've had shut-ins now. Things are starting to normalize a bit. So you're going to start to see that bottom out. But you could say, well, if it's not going on a truck, is it going on a rail? And the answer is here, no. They're both down. You know, there's been overcapacity in the trucking market, so it makes sense to see trucking come down. But rail has been negative since 2019, and it's important to appreciate where that sits in the strength of the economy as we consider a potential recovery outside of COVID. So when we think about taking that and kind of launching forward into the shipping data, let's look at the ports. Let's look at what shipments have done. You've seen the shipments have dropped through in April, back down again to the recession. The other important component is freight. If you look at shipping, ship data continues to be just terrible. Now, while that's terrible, the air freight's actually getting a little bit better, and it's because we've lost so many passenger planes, because some part of the passenger belly of the jet would have a little bit of packages that were going to one place to another. So you're going to see a little bit of tightness in that market, but the bigger one is going to be the containers. That's when you're moving the big boats, a lot of stuff. Now, while we've talked a lot about the negatives and the different components, we have to look at what sentiment look like. How are things looking? And here, the Bloomberg has one of theirs, which is the comfort index, which you've seen now, based on just the comparison to the S&P, it's had a huge step back. So there's pieces out there that are saying, look, the indexes are the consumer's starting to struggle. There's concerns out there. Things are shifting a little bit. But how is the overall consumer feeling on a global level? And then we'll bring it right back down to the US. When we look at Asian exports, so first let's look at the Chinese industrial output. So they have their pretend numbers where they just start throwing darts. And you can see that there's been, according to them, a increase. Now, industrial production could have increased because you have manufacturing open, but it doesn't mean it's going somewhere. So now we have to consider, well, is it going anywhere? And that's when we look at Asian export data. That's when we can look at China and South Korea. And here you can see new export orders and South Korean exports, which have taken out the lows and continue to press the lows. So some of the backlog has been cleared through the Chinese ports. They've obviously been sitting on things. Ships haven't been able to get there. So you're going to get that backlog clearing, but the new orders is a projection going forward. And we can see that there is a lot of softness going through, with South Korea coming in at a down 25% is the estimate. Now, when we look at that, well, what about Italy? What about some of these other areas that could see some benefit? And here you can see the Italy industrial PMI, and it's just, the industrial growth, and you can see how far it's down. It took out the low that was established in 2007, and just given where we sit, where Italy sits, where Europe sits, I just think Italy is going to be something to watch when you consider the pressure in GDP, which is estimated now to be down over 9%. And you can see that we're not going to get any kind of manufacturing uplift. Now, when we take that shift and we go, all right, let's come back to the US. Well, we actually had a little bit of decent data. The consumer, the sentiment is actually starting to bottom out a little bit. It's still above where we were in 2009, but this is something where we're starting to see a little bit of normalization. And if you consider sitting at home for 2 months, this looks pretty good. We're starting to get some easing. People are feeling a little bit better. So you're going to get this recovery and sentiment. But now let's look at how people feel about the current economic situation. And you can see that there's been a little bit of a recovery, which is good. People think that hiring is going to start. Manufacturing is going to open. This is something that we're going to watch because obviously these people spend money. So if they're spending money when they feel better, then this is something that we have to keep an eye on to say, hey, maybe we are going to get a recovery in refined products and things start pulling through. But we also have to look at employment abroad. And Europe had their employment data and it came down again, even though it was supposed to be stable at this point. And it was going to be stable based on policy and based on support, but it's right back down to those 2011 levels. So we're getting conflicting information. The consumer doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you think of it from, well, what are they looking at? But and then if you think about, well, they're going to get back to normal, there's a certain amount of normalcy, you can kind of get, okay, well, they're starting to feel a little bit better, but is that translating to dollars? And that's what we're going to focus on as we continue to look at this economic data. Now's the time to talk about what C6 and Primary Vision has been working on, which is port and terminal data for some key importing and exporting nations. We've been looking at crude, or refined products, chemicals, and everything that matters for the energy industry. So please reach out through the email below, and somebody will reach out to you shortly to set up a trial. We've covered some updates in terms of OPEC, supply, demand, where things sit, some of the economic data that's going to remain a pressure on demand, and now it's time to turn to the Primary Vision frac spread count. So as we look out, and what is the frac spread? Today it came in at 45. Now, the key is the pace in which it has come down. So we had that big fall over since February, but we're starting to see that kind of balance out. Some of the interesting facts coming into the Primary Vision frac spread count in terms of the data that we're seeing: 177 frac spreads in the Permian as of January 2019, and now we're at an all-time low of 28. And as we look at last year versus the week over week, it's important to appreciate what a frac spread is and what we're trying to look at. We're mapping it out and looking at it from the perspective of new completions and refracs. There is a lot of managing the decline curve that we have to consider when we're looking at E&Ps in terms of maintenance CapEx and what they're going to try to do during this time period of low price, very low demand. So what does that mean? That means that a company has an option. I either complete a new well, I shut in a well, I choke back a well, or I do a refrac or a clean out, whether it's an acid wash, wire line, or some maintenance to kind of manage that decline curve. And what is the decline curve? The decline curves can vary based on region, based on basin. And it's a matter of how much do I want to spend to protect where I am on the other side of this. If my natural decline curve is 30%, 30% of doing nothing over the course of 18 months is a lot. So what do? I'm going to focus on how do I keep it at 15 to 20%. Well, let's do a refrac in these 3 locations. Let's do an acid wash. Let's do some sort of work over a wire line to really open things up and manage that decline curve. Maybe I'll do a shut-in, or I'll shut in this well for 30 days, help it repressurize, and then open it back up for 30 days and let that flow. There's a lot of things to consider in terms of minimum volume commitments, or MVCs. Where is the well placed? Where can I maximize my realized prices? So when you see things in terms of, they're saying that these frac spreads are XYZ, you have to consider are they new completions and refracs, or is it something completely different in terms of just a crew that's going to be there for a short period of time to protect that decline curve? So when we're looking at it from the perspective of the E&P, there's a lot of decisions to make, and there's a lot of areas in which the CapEx is going to compete, especially in such a, let's just say a pressured situation. So now when you look at OPEC, and OPEC's talking about how they've cut production or flow by 17 million barrels overall, them talking now about well, am I going to really cut in June based past my 9.7? We're going to have that discussion. There's a lot of things to consider in terms of where is the supply going to come, because we've talked about demand, but supply is a big part of where price is going to go, and what should the curve look like when I start to make these decisions on, am I going to bring back a new fleet? So just to kind of reiterate and recap, the frac spread count at 45, we're seeing some interest in some of the natural gas basins in terms of new completions moving in, some horsepower moving around, and the Permian we think is going to be relatively sticky over the next let's call it the next few weeks at this level as we start to kind of find that bottom. We think we'll probably get to about 43 as we start to as companies start to figure out where do they want to focus new production. We're going to come to you next week on Wednesday and Friday. Wednesday, we're going to look at the EIA again, going through the data, marrying it with some of the new economic information that we're gaining over the next couple of weeks. We now have the Saudi crude showing up in pad 3. So it's going to be interesting to see how is that starting to get incorporated into the pad 3 and the refiners and our import numbers. And then Friday, again, we're going to have another roundup and some information on LNG and natural gas, and again, the primary vision frac spread count. So thanks again for watching. Please subscribe. Any questions are always welcome. We like to have some back and forth in the comments. Thanks again.